All right, well, hello everyone. My name is Kelsey Jones, and I'm a program director with the National Association of State Energy Officials. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today, featuring the National Academies on the role of net metering in the evolving electricity system. Several members of the committee who conducted this study will be sharing an overview of some of the key findings of particular interest to states. And so thank you to the U.S. Department of Energy for their support of this webinar. Next slide. So before I turn things over to our three esteemed speakers, I just wanted to run through a few housekeeping items. This is a Zoom webinar, so you'll be able to add any questions for the speakers to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address all of those at the end of the presentations. Additionally, for anyone interested in returning to these materials, the recording and webinar slides will be shared with all registered attendees in the next week or so. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the webinar today. We're joined by Janet Gale Besser, Chair of the National Academy Study Committee on the role of net metering in the evolving electricity system, Mohit Chhabra, California Technical Lead and Advisor, Climate and Clean Energy Program with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and Elena Krieger, Director of Research with PSC Healthy Energy. So over to you, Janet.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, and welcome to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present the results of our study. We spent about a year putting the report together. You can go to the next slide. A committee of 14 people drawn from all over the country, different perspectives. They brought their own expertise to the table, and in writing the report, we also had presentations from all of the stakeholders representing all sides of the issues, from utilities to solar developers to consumer advocates and environmental organizations. And then with their input, we put together a report that we hope addresses the statement of task given to us by the Department of Energy. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that. And our charge was to examine the medium to long-term impacts of net metering on the electricity grid and consumers. And the goal was we were asked to evaluate net metering's potential to contribute to a decarbonizing, equitable, and resilient electricity system. This has been a big topic and a controversial topic, and our goal was to reach consensus on guidelines that would be helpful to policymakers in both states with lots of solar, as well as states that were just starting on the path to promoting, encouraging distributed solar generation and other distributed generation resources. If you go to the next slide, we took an opportunity. We started out by saying, why are we doing the study? Why is it needed? And what was important to understand is that since the inception of net metering, a lot has changed on the electricity system, and a lot is continuing to change. And the key drivers are the changing economics, including declining costs for distributed generation, and as well as the availability of technology innovations, new technologies, both on the customer side of the meter and for utilities so that they could see what's going on the system. New demands have been placed on the system. Policymakers are asking utilities and electricity system operators not only to deliver safe, reliable, and affordable electricity, but to facilitate carbon reductions on the system, to facilitate, address affordability issues for customers. And so with those demands, with new technologies, with changing economics, you then add changing customer expectations. Customers are used to getting a lot more services from the products that they buy, and they want the ability to manage their energy use, manage their energy costs, as well as help to facilitate the clean energy transition. So if you combine all of those things, which are contributing to changes in the system, it just follows that net metering policy may also need to change. We started, if you go to the next slide, with two basics. We have a chapter on net metering 101 is what we called it informally. How does it actually work? Because we found that there were different understandings of what was going on with net metering. One thing that's important to understand is that customers remain connected to the electricity grid, to the distribution system. They pull power from the grid and consume it sometimes, and they push power to the grid when their solar is generating at other times. Many solar customers, though not shown here, have also been investing in storage capabilities. So when their solar is not needed or is less valuable to the grid, they can store it for their own use at another time of day. But I think the key message here is solar customers generally remain connected using their solar and their battery to help manage their own costs. The second, if you go to the next slide, foundation setting exercise we undertook was to agree on terms and definitions. Again, with topics like net metering, you can often be talking past each other. So we came up with terminology, starting with traditional net metering, recognizing that it's a billing mechanism that effectively credits production from behind the meter distributed generation at the retail rate by offsetting consumption and providing credits for electricity exported to the grid. If you think about the days of analog meters, literally the meter ran backward, and at the end of the month, the net was what the customer was charged or credited. We came up with terminology to talk about net metering variance, referring to refinements to the rate-making approach or design that underlies traditional net metering. We came up with the language alternatives to refer to policies and programs outside rate making that have been implemented or are under consideration to encourage adoption of distributed solar. So this might be rebates, this might be incentives, it might be low interest loans, but it's not a rate making construct. The variance, there were two dimensions on which to the variance. One is that the key thing is that customers are charged one price, the retail price for the electricity they consume, the same price that other customers are charged. And customers with DG are credited or compensated for the electricity that their DG or their solar produces at a different rate. That different rate may be determined by the value of solar, a calculation that may be done taking into account the benefits solar provides to the grid, to the customer, to society, or feed-in tariffs, which are often tariffs that are setting the compensation rate for the solar at a level to encourage a certain amount of solar deployment. So the terms used for the difference in compensation between what you pay and what you are paid are net billing, inflow, outflow, and buy all, sell all, although that term is really buy all, credit all. You go to the next slide. We then move to sort of where do we stand in terms of adoption of distributed solar, storage, and other customer generation. So on the left-hand side, you see the big green swath is combined heat and power that customers and largely commercial and industrial customers have implemented back to the 1970s. And the yellow segment is the adoption of solar that we've seen increase significantly in the early 2000s. On the right-hand side, you get a picture of the adoption of storage, which you can see is also rapidly increasing. A couple of things to note here. Virtually all of the solar that's been installed is net metering, and virtually all net meter generation is solar PV. The other point to recognize here is the vast majority of customer-sited battery storage has been installed in conjunction with solar and net metering. If you go to the next slide, so what does this look like across the United States? The left-hand map of the United States shows compensation structures for distributed solar are sort of a patchwork across the country. But one of the things that you can see is that almost all of the states have some form of compensation, generally net metering provided to solar. In recent years, when you move away from the blue retail rate net metering, some states have been revising their net metering policies, either in response to rising adoption rates or concerns about potential rate impacts on non-solar customers. On the right-hand side, what you can see is that by and large, even with all those states having net metering policies, most of the states in the United States have not seen a dramatic penetration of residential solar. You see Most states have less than 1% of customers adopting solar. Only 2 states, California and Hawaii, have more than 10% solar. And then there are a handful of other states that are at the 4 to 5% level. And one of the things to note here is that while there may be concerns about the impacts on non-adopting customers, for most states, the adoption rate is so low that impact is de minimis. We then, I'm going to just talk very briefly about the structure of the report. Laying this groundwork, we then went and looked at the economic, equity, technology, and regulatory and legal considerations associated with net metering. And I'm going to hand off now to my colleague Mohit to talk about the economic considerations.
Thank you, Janet. So foundational economic principle is that the price to consume electricity or the retail rate should be at the social marginal cost of electricity. And the social marginal cost of electricity is the total cost to produce electricity and any environmental externalities associated with producing and delivering it. So for electricity, it's the cost of producing a unit of electricity on the margin, transmission and distribution losses, congestion prices, and any greenhouse gases and air pollution associated with it. Pricing electricity in such a manner may not always be possible due to the many policy considerations that need to be adhered to when designing rates. Next slide, please. So this leads us to our first recommendation. If rates are equal to the social marginal cost of electricity on average, then simple net metering will lead to economically efficient outcomes, even though there might be some difference on impacts on participating and non-participating customers. The amount of investment in DG technologies would be, on average, optimal in the region. Second recommendation is that in the absence of economically efficient rate structures or pricing electricity as social marginal cost, a buy-all, sell-all, or a net billing tariff based on the value of clean distributed generation would suffice. The difference between net metering compensation and the true marginal cost to produce electricity could cause distortions. And if the net metering compensation is greater than marginal costs, then solar customers are overcompensated, and that's when the cost shift occurs. However, if net metering compensation is lower than marginal costs, then solar customers are undercompensated. Finally, the final recommendation for this slide is that the benefits of net metering are location and time specific. And so when we evaluate net metering, we really should consider local conditions and local policy priorities. A simple example is that electric retail rates and the value of solar both vary by almost a factor of 4 across the country and not in a similar manner. So you really need to be careful when we make this comparison. Next slide, please. Specific policy priorities, such as trying to increase solar adoption among low-income customers or targeting specific location, may warrant additional incentives. And these incentives should be transparently layered on to net metering compensation and funded appropriately. Social goals, for example, should ideally be funded from sources outside electric rates. And then finally, when determining the compensation for net metering, regulators should account for environmental and other externalities that clean distributed generation avoids, or state policy goals that clean distributed generation can help meet. These externalities can either be valued at the environmental damage that clean distributed generation avoids, or at the cost to achieve the same local policy goals through alternate supply side technologies. The theory being that if a customer doesn't install distributed generation, then additional supply side resources would need to be acquired to meet the same policy goals in certain states. Thank you. And I'm going to pass it on to Elena.
Thanks. So equity interacts with net metering in numerous direct and indirect ways. Direct impacts can include things like the impact of net metering on electricity bills and energy affordability for both participants and non-participants. Indirect impacts can include everything from labor force impacts, the result from solar policies, to societal impacts associated with changes to air quality and climate change. We looked at the demographics of net metering participants and non-participants, as well as associated impacts and benefits, the interaction of net metering with structural inequities associated with the existing energy system, broader environmental, health, societal, and resilience implications, and procedural equity questions about who gets to weigh in on rate design in the first place. Next slide, please. Equity can come in many forms, but we broadly considered equity in 4 categories. Distributional equity affects the allocation of costs and benefits of net metering. Whose bills are affected? Who has access to rooftop solar? Numerous studies have found that solar adoption lags in low-income communities, communities of color, and for renters. And while these trends are improving, these disparities persist. These are also often the same households who have the highest energy cost burdens and could most benefit from any affordability or bill consistency benefits provided by net metered solar. Additional distributional equity concerns emerge if there are any cost shifts to or from participants to non-participants. If such cost shifts exist, they are likely to have an equity component because of the disparities in rooftop solar adoption rates in low-income and other communities. But any such cost shifts are likely to not be meaningful until rooftop solar adoption rates are much, much higher than the low level of adoption we see in the vast majority of the country. Procedural equity refers to fairness in who gets to meaningfully participate in decision-making and the transparency of decision-making processes. For net metering, this can emerge, for example, in high hurdles to participation in utility commission cases where net metering tariffs are designed. Intergenerational equity refers to society's obligation toward future generations. For example, if the solar net metering tariff is designed to reflect the value of solar's environmental impacts and benefits, it would likely include the social cost of carbon, whose valuation and the discount rate used for this calculation are based in part on impacts to future generations. And structural equity refers to making decisions in recognition of the historical inequities in institutions, investments, policies, and other areas that have legacy impacts today. Structural inequities in a region, for example, could include a history of redlining, which has contributed to lack of wealth creation and cash available for home purchase and repair for Black households, presenting barriers to rooftop solar adoption and therefore participation in net metering. Next slide. Our first recommendation is that all rate design should be developed consistent with updated rate-making principles and with a focus on the equity impact of rates, particularly for those struggling to pay their bills. All customers should have a voice in net metering design, as they should for all rate design, which may include efforts such as compensation to encourage participation. Second, decision makers should include not only the total cost and benefit of any decision, both economic and societal, but the distribution of those costs and benefits. Not only what is the average rate impact, but what is the rate impact for adopters or non-adopters of different income groups? Not only how much air pollution might be offset in a value of solar calculation, but is it reduced near upwind from environmentally overburdened populations? Moreover, sufficient data needs to be collected about solar adoption and impact and made public and easily understandable so that these analyses can be conducted. These impacts extend to public health, jobs, land use, and also whether certain decisions lock in specific energy pathways. Next slide, please. Building on the first recommendation, it is important to strive for procedural equity, and rate making should consider rate impacts on various customer segments throughout the development, implementation, and evaluation of net metering programs, including authentic engagement. Such engagement is also critical for understanding how to weight the different distributional benefits and impacts described in the previous recommendation. Next slide. Investments to address historical inequities should be considered. For example, studies have found lower solar hosting capacity on the distribution grid in California's disadvantaged communities and census tracts with a larger share of Black inhabitants. And grid investments may be required to enable distributed energy resource access in these areas. And as Mohit touched upon earlier, policymakers should also consider complementary policies to achieve certain goals. For example, resilience is not well incentivized by net metering in most cases, because the optimal mix of solar and storage for everyday use is not the same design that would be resilient for a multi-day outage. Similarly, even targeted net metering rates alone may not be enough to enable solar adoption for low and moderate income customers who often lack access to finance for solar, who may need roof upgrades to support solar, or are more likely to be renters. Community and government-funded programs may be useful for helping achieve goals such as resilience, to develop targeted incentives or financing for low-income households, to support the development of community solar and other such complementary efforts. Janet, back to you.
Thanks, Elena and Mohit. So we next looked at the technology considerations related to net metering. And these really related to two things: technology advances that on the distributed generation side, but more of our focus was on what kinds of technologies would be needed on the distribution system to provide visibility into what was happening on the customer side of the meter, and to address what was becoming a more complex problem to solve in terms of balancing supply and demand and operating the system as customers both changed how much electricity they used at various points in time and how much electricity they produced. We focused not on interconnection, but integration in order to capture value of customer distributed generation for all customers. It's really important that be integrated into the system so that the utility doesn't need to build redundant distribution lines, knows what's happening, and they can do better forecasting. So these involve challenges relating to the real-time balance of supply and demand, investment in storage and flexible DER, which are tools to use to manage the timing of the production of the distributed generation, technical issues related to how two-way flows and grid losses are handled across the distribution system, protection equipment changes, and what is the impact of the loss of synchronous generators with motors that can provide some stability to the grid when there are outages versus inverter-based resources like solar and wind, which need smart inverters, other technologies added to them to provide that kind of service to the grid. As I mentioned, customer demand becomes more uncertain, more challenging to forecast, and the typical approach of top-down planning and operations is challenged by this sort of bottom-up changes that are occurring. So advances, the good news is advances in technology are out there, can help with these integration challenges and increase complexities. So this led us to our recommendations. Next slide, please. The first of which is to recognizing that there need to be direct investments in the distribution system to integrate increasing amounts of behind-the-meter generation, such as rooftop solar. You often hear the story told that if you have lots of distributed generation, you won't need to make as much investment in the distribution system, and that may be the case in the future. But in the near term, that investment is going to be required to integrate the DG, to have visibility into it, to manage it and control it under certain circumstances to maintain reliable, safe operation of the grid. You also need to be making investments that will help to suitably site and operate the behind-the-meter DG, that will send efficient price signals to developers and customers as to where that DG can provide the greatest system benefits. Which circuits have hosting capacity, which circuits are overloaded, where can distributed generation help to address overloaded circuits, reduce demand on that circuit, and where it would exacerbate problems. Our second recommendation is that relates again to making the best use of DG and DER. Utilities must make investments not to integrate the technologies and increase their visibility and manage them. With the democratization of the grid and with increased public and private partnerships, DG has the potential to increase value, to have greater value for all customers, but only if it can be seen and managed by the grid operators. So a third recommendation that we had, I'm not sure is in this set of slides, was that, but it leads right into the next slide. So go to the next slide. But really is, if utilities are making these investments, they need to see a path clear to recovering the cost of these investments. And that leads us right to the regulatory, legal, and market considerations. And these relate to net metering and what customers are charged and compensated for their power, but also how the utility is compensated or is able to recover the cost of the investments it needs to make to integrate DG. So as you well know, there are many policy considerations around the provision and the pricing of electricity services to customers. This chapter focuses on state regulatory issues that intersect with net metering policy. It looks at net metering's interaction with the local penetration levels of behind the meter DG. As we said earlier, the impact on the system does relate to how much DG is on the system, the impact on rates, the impact on the distribution grid infrastructure. And then we tried to talk about, we took principles of the design of policies and aligned them with long-standing principles of rate making and how those needed to be balanced. So that led us to several recommendations. If you go to the next slide. First, decision makers about electric utility rates and policymakers should take into account the DG technology costs of market maturity are at a stage both technically and economically where traditional net metering policies to support the deployment of DG need to be addressed and revisited. The traditional net metering set up at full retail rates initially was sufficient, but in states where you're seeing increased adoption and everywhere where we're seeing reduced costs, that argues for a change in the policy. As you look at the policy changes, decision makers should rely on the important traditional rate-making principles as updated to reflect the application of new technologies and service offerings. And these include cost causation, rate simplicity, fairness, revenue adequacy, and simplicity, so that customers can understand what's going on, they can perceive it as fair. If you go to the next slide, decision makers should design compensation approaches for the power produced by customers, DG, consistent with how they value other resources. So this gets to value of solar calculations you hear of avoided costs, but what in fact is the value of this energy produced? Time varying rates is another way in which this can be done. More solar produced at 2 in the afternoon on a system that has a lot of solar already is not that valuable. But if the customer has storage in conjunction with their solar and can export power to the grid between 5 and 8 p.m., it is more valuable, and they can be customers can be compensated through a net metering mechanism based on rates if those are time of use rates. So these are some of the considerations that policymakers need to take into account. And then finally, our fourth recommendation here is something that both Mohit and Elena touched on, which is given the economic and equity challenges associated with using a net metering rate-making construct to provide all of the compensation for customer distributed generation and all of the incentives, policymakers need to look beyond electricity rates and consider, and where appropriate, use other policy instruments such as tax incentives, building codes, attractively priced loans or even grants to low-income households, and other policies to achieve goals related to the adoption of clean distributed generation. Some examples are the various federal funding sources available now, and states are starting to consider, as you probably well know, being the state energy offices, new ways to be compensating customers for their adoption of DG. So going to our last slide, what we concluded really is a more intentional and integrated approach than traditional net metering is required to support a more resilient, equitable, and decarbonized electricity system. Net metering has been very successful. The foundation is one that has enabled the adoption of distributed solar that has provided value not only for adopting customers, but for others, but it needs to be updated. As you consider updating it, we have sort of 3 principles here, or 3 pillars. First, integrated. The committee recognizes that a more interdependent future for customers and utilities and other product and energy services providers as well as distributed and grid scale generation that is going to require the integration of DG with the rest of the electricity system. It cannot just be the technology that is tacked on to the edge of the grid. Consistent. Redesigned rate structures and net metering need to be consistent with basic principles of electricity rate design. Social marginal cost is an admirable goal, but when customers need a service like electricity imbued with the public interest, other considerations come into play, such as balancing efficiency, simplicity, stability, fairness, and revenue adequacy to utilities making investments. And then well-informed. Net metering design really has to be taken into account the local context, both the geographic context, the time context, the status of markets. I think, as Mohit said, I hadn't realized it was quite 4 times. You have differences in fundamental electricity prices that vary widely across the country. You have differences in the way generation is produced, more or less carbon emitting resources. And then you have differences in the build out of the distribution system, and the location of distributed generation will affect the value it provides or whether it adds additional burden to the system. One of the things I'll just conclude here by saying is that we see these recommendations as applying not only for states that have done a lot already with net metering and incentives for solar, but can also provide guidance to states that are just starting down this path. And with that, you can go to the last slide and we can be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Janet, Elena, and Mohit, for the great presentation. This was extremely informative, and I hope folks, if they haven't already read the report, will take time to do so over the next couple of weeks. But I did have a couple of questions myself, and then there are some in the Q&A box. So I think I'll start with those. Catherine, feel free to stop sharing the slides. Great. Yeah, so one of the questions that came in from the audience touches on recommendations about states considering environmental benefits as a measure to determine the appropriate compensation rate. With states rapidly decarbonizing their grid, it would seem that the environmental value of behind-the-meter DG would decrease. Does the study investigate how to address long-term policymaking decisions, replacing net metering with something else with rapidly changing variables?
So I think I'll take a crack at this and hand off to others, but I think the study does provide a framework for taking a look at that question, and really goes to the last point I was making, which is you need to take into account the circumstances of your grid. If you're in a state that has decarbonization policies or that is served by a largely decarbonized electricity grid, then the carbon value of additional solar or the carbon reduction value of additional solar will be different than if you're in a state where, in fact, the electricity from the grid may still be provided by coal or other plants that do have emissions associated with them. In the state with more carbon in the grid, then the value of distributed solar in terms of carbon reduction will be greater. So these are principles that can be applied to whatever your circumstances are. So Mohit, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'll add that in most grids, the marginal resource, even as the grid gets cleaner, is a peaker plant. So the value of an additional clean energy unit would be that peaker plant runs less. Now, how you value it, especially if your state has clean energy goals that are monetized either as policy compliance costs, clean energy credits, or RECs, that value will help inform how you compensate clean generation as well. So in states where the marginal resource, for example, is offshore wind, you might have a higher value of carbon abatement than a state in which the marginal resource is something a lot cheaper. So this is again speaking to local conditions. How else would you reach your policy goals? And I think aligns with the framework that Jen just described as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question that came in was, would new approaches to net metering not require upgrades to AMI infrastructure, or can these be done with existing infrastructure?
The ability to compensate customers who've installed DG for their production at a rate different from what they pay for electricity may not require advanced metering, but it will require something more than, it will require tracking those two separately. So you see models where in some states you're required to have 2 meters, a production meter and a consumption meter. That adds to the cost of for the customer. But there does need to be some way to differentiate production and consumption. That said, there are some of the more sophisticated opportunities to use time of use rates to value customer distributed generation. I think will require more sophisticated metering so that you can compensate the customer for solar produced at 2 p.m. peak time of the day for solar, but maybe not peak time for the grid anymore, versus 5 p.m. when solar production is declining. But if you've stored it, you can get a higher value. That's going to require some more sophisticated metering.
Just a quick equity note there too, is that if you're going to be introducing something like that, ensuring that there are approaches that renters and low-income households can get access to appliances and other things that can actually respond to time of use rates. So you can't just focus on the enabling metering infrastructure.
Thank you, Janet and Elena. One other question that came in talks about they consider the avoided cost of DG to be the sum of energy capacity and REC value. When looking at the social marginal costs, is considering the avoided environmental externality and avoided REC costs double counting? Mohit, if you want to take that one.
Unless Janet, you have something to say.
No, I was going to say, Mohit, why don't you take that?
So you would do, you either would value externalities at the damage cost or the marginal abatement cost or cost of clean energy policy. So you would choose one of those two. Note that the value of the REC is likely the value today to meet current renewable energy goals. So when you do apply that, also think about what is the true marginal value of distributed generation relative to your ultimate goals as well. Because the REC, a DG you install today will stay on for 20 years or so, and the REC value it attains will also evolve through time. So you want to think about that too. But that's right, you don't want to just add up the two. You want to make sure you're being incremental, and you either want to go with a damage or a abatement way and stick with it.
I want to provide a quick note here, thinking about California from the energy storage standpoint, which is that just adding, potentially clean energy technologies doesn't have equivalent emission reduction benefits across the board. The most obvious way to look at this actually is from our self-generation incentive program, which provides incentive for distributed storage adoption. And in the first round of that, emissions actually went up. And that was because people were adopting it primarily to reduce demand charges, and there wasn't any requirement to actually have emission reductions. And so there has had to be a very explicit requirement that batteries are charged at times when there's low emissions in order to ensure that you're getting emission reductions from that storage adoption. And so I think similar kinds of effects might be seen if you, again, as Mohit said, don't take into account the damages and you're only looking at something like the marginal renewable energy adoption, which is being done to meet specific renewable energy targets, but doesn't take into account some of those environmental and public health costs.
Yeah, and in some states, in fact, storage can only participate in net metering if it can demonstrate that it has been charged by either the solar owned by the customer or another clean resource, so that you're not, in fact, compensating storage that's been charged with dirtier grid electricity.
Thank you. And thinking about some of those equity questions, I wonder if you all would be able to talk a little bit about what the relationship between net metering and community solar looks like, or if you touch on community solar at all within the report.
So I'll start and then hand off to you, Elena. So we do talk about community solar and virtual net metering in the report in a couple of different ways. One, community solar is a way to enable customers who would not be able to put solar on their own roofs. Either they don't own their own roof, they live in apartments, they live in multifamily housing, they don't have the economic wherewithal. It allows them to participate and get benefits from solar adoption. Community solar could be built by a developer who then finds off-takers for the RECs, or it could be a program that is offered by the utility, where in fact they're building community solar and offering that to customers. It's called virtual net metering because in fact, the off-takers are not necessarily in the same location as the solar. It's a way of broadening the ability to participate in net metering. It can have impacts on the costs of distributed solar in terms of, in some jurisdictions where you see a proliferation of larger standalone solar, that increases our penetration numbers focused on individual adoption, but if you think about calculating that differently, if you have a lot of large community solar installations, it may look different. So Elena, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I guess one note is that slightly larger installations might be cheaper to install,
Yeah.
and therefore also can make it somewhat more affordable for people who might not otherwise have access to solar. I think that there are ways to, again, integrate community solar with things like, lower compensated rates, like integrate them with different kinds of affordability programs, which can be valuable. I will note that there's a lot of regulatory barriers, often including things like linking together multiple buildings and in order to take advantage of multiple, maybe adjoining rooftops on different meters will sometimes limit the ability to enable an adequate community solar installation, particularly if we want to do something like link it with storage or enable like multiple meters to be averaged out. California's been introducing new virtual net metering rules. Sorry, all of this a little off record, but which is not in a report, but they've had new rules that has made it somewhat more complicated to, let's say, to multifamily virtual net metering. So thinking about the regulatory barriers is important.
No, that is very important. And that reminds me, the report does talk about solar and storage together and microgrids and opportunities to provide, benefits in that fashion too. If you think about resilience hubs, there's an opportunity to do that with compensation provided through net metering for the solar.
And what we've seen, unfortunately, is often you can't link multiple buildings for that, which has limited the ability to build out sufficient solar to provide backup resilience and meet some of those additional targets.
Thanks for sharing that. We have a active microgrid state working group that I think would benefit from that section of the report. So appreciate you flagging that. One other question that came in the Q&A box is about FERC Order 2222, and with additional compensation through FERC Order 2222, is net metering not absolute in the long run?
I think there is another way to compensate distributed generation. And if in fact the generation is being sold into the wholesale market and getting wholesale market revenues, you may want to be looking at how the additional compensation that net metering provides is layered onto that, because you don't want to be double counting. I don't think, Mohit, we talked a lot about 2222.
No, we didn't, because we were looking at net metering as a state policy,
Right.
and also it's not clear to me whether customers would be able to double earn, and also if they aren't allowed to double earn, it's logical that customers and aggregators will leverage whichever form of compensation is more advantageous for them. And because the FERC order will mostly be wholesale prices, those are always lower than retail rates, because retail rates bundle a lot of other grid costs into them as well. Something to keep in mind.
Thank you. One other question, thinking about how states are approaching net metering policies, and I know you showed the map on the earlier slide and had some conversations with Missouri in the chat, but I wonder if you could expand a little bit maybe on some of the state examples you cover in the report and kind of the language states are generally using when approaching net metering or some of the challenges they're encountered.
I didn't take a look at the chat during the presentation, but I will say this. Some of the states are looking at, and I'm going to reveal my East Coast ignorance, and then I think it's Minnesota or Michigan that is looking at buy all, sell all, or buy all, credit all mechanisms, where in fact they are calculating a value of solar to provide the compensation. New York State has what they call their VADER or VDER, the value of distributed energy resources. And that's the rate at which exported power is compensated rather than at the retail rate. So I would say we cite bill all, sell all, or credit all as the direction to go if you can't get retail electricity prices set at social marginal costs. And I think that it's fair to say that's the primary trend that has been pursued. And then the question is, you're calculating what that compensation rate is for what's being credited or sold. You can look at value of solar, or if you have, for example, a policy where you want to encourage a certain amount of solar generation, you might create a feed-in tariff, which is just setting the price that you think will elicit that level of generation. Feed-in tariffs were very popular in Europe. They set a price, and that got a lot of solar onto the system.
Thank you. And building on that a little bit, do you have any suggestions for a state that is looking to reform net metering and kind of what the best next step would be to do so?
I think our recommendations really follow along the lines of, if you're looking to reform net metering, one, you might want to do some analysis to see, what is the problem you're trying to solve. If you are concerned that there's a cost shift that's occurring from solar customers to non-solar customers, look at how many solar customers you have and what that impact is. And then separating the retail rate from the compensation rate is, if you're sticking with rate making mechanisms, is a way to get a better match of compensation to the value that the solar is providing. Looking beyond rates is another thing that you may want to consider if in fact you want to be decarbonizing your system or addressing equity issues. Do those programs need to be funded out of electricity rates? Elena and Mohit, I invite you to offer your thoughts.
I do want to revisit the thing that we said earlier, which is like cost shifts of this scale are really not a primary equity concern in the vast majority of the country. And the concern instead is ensuring that, at least from an equity standpoint, that you have, programs and supporting programs that would enable access to the benefits of net metered solar for low-income households and renters and so forth. And so that if you're trying to think about it from an equity standpoint, I'd be less worried about cost shifts in most states and more worried about ensuring that there's enabling programs, complementary policies, and other efforts to improve participation in the process of developing the policies and in ensuring that there is financing available so that everyone actually has access to these programs.
Thank you all. And Mohit, feel free to jump in.
I would just say, if Jen hasn't already covered this, take a look at your rates too. And because they've really formed the basis of all tariffs, and it's hard and it gets harder to keep having special rates for different classes of customers. At some point in time, that catches up with you. So to the extent your default rates are as cost-based as possible, everything else becomes, you need less adjustments.
Thank you. And thinking about net metering and potential corresponding decrease in electricity bills, did you look at all about how customers may be looking at other kind of energy efficiency upgrades or home energy improvements as a result? I know there's a lot of interest from the state energy offices on the rebate program through the IRA. So just curious if you touched on that at all in the report.
I would say we touched on it. I mean, one of the things that we said in passing is that you should do all the energy efficiency first. It becomes important in terms of sizing the solar. You want to size the solar to serve an efficient, well-insulated house rather than a leaky, not efficient house. But we did not go into any depth on energy efficiency in this report.
Thank you. And maybe one other question for Elena on the equity piece. I know that states would probably be interested in leveraging some of the recommendations within the report, but I'm curious if you have any other resources on net metering, maybe summaries of this report or other resources that states could leverage for educational purposes for the customers in their states.
I'm sorry, I was trying to think offhand, and I don't have anything that comes to me except that California does have a policy that they recently rolled out, which compensates people to participate in various public utility commission processes. And it's everything from, showing up at an individual day event of some kind to larger, trainings in order to get people engaged at the utility commission. I think that a lot of what we've been talking about is access to who has solar and who doesn't. But I think that participation component, looking at those ways to actually incentivize people and support people to have a voice in how these policies are designed. What is the value of solar to who and how to think about that? I would take a look at that specific set of policies in California.
The other thing I would,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Elena.
I was going to say, I can't think of other specific net metering guides though. Janet?
So I would say the report is long, but I would particularly look at some of the references in the equity section. There's a lot of good reference material here. There is also an executive summary that may be more digestible. And I think some information on the website where you can find the report that may be useful as well. But we did a lot of research and we had a lot of people come talk to us. So some of those references are just, it's a great way to, they're curated already for you so that you can go in and look at them rather than searching the web yourself.
Thank you. That's helpful. Well, I know we're coming up on 5 minutes. I don't know if each of you had any final remarks or anything that you didn't get a chance to touch on during the presentation that you'd like to share with the group.
No, I just thank you very much for consideration of the report. Brent Hurd, the staff director for this project, dropped into the chat the link to the interactive website, which is another easily accessible way to get more of the information from the report.
Thank you, Brent.
I want to say again, thanks for having us. And something that I think we sort of touched on, but I want to bring back to the forefront is we shouldn't be thinking about net metering policies in isolation, right? If we're trying to achieve different equity and societal goals, what is the value of emission reductions and things like that, that those should be applied consistently across, the entire sort of utility rate structure. We should be thinking about other policies that can achieve certain goals and whether that should happen inside or outside the rate making system, and not sort of put the onus of figuring out what all of these values are just on net metering policy alone, right? This is something that is broader about utility rate reform across the board.
Right. Just reiterate our pillars: integrated, consistent, and well-informed.
Yes, consistent and well-informed. I would like to underscore something I think you said earlier, Janet, that gets forgotten is as conditions change, your net metering priorities change too. And generally states may try to make changes when things are at some sort of breaking point for something. We really need to change something, and there's lots of controversy. So to the extent forward-looking principles can guide consistent decision-making, keep people prepared, that really helps.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all, Janet, Elena, and Mohit, and Brent for facilitating this introduction. It was a really valuable conversation, and we appreciate your time. We'll be sure to connect you with any follow-up questions we receive from the states and to distribute all of the resources to the registrants in the next week or two. So thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care.